in the second half of the course, we've gone over the main general theoretical approaches, theories, a little strong, frameworks, perspectives, leadership, markets, political culture, arts, consumption. And we now are going into some of these themes in a little more specifics, as well as with individual cases, in the sense that we've got huge variety and we're getting more and more complications in the world, and within one city we can have 6 or 7 different kinds of frameworks which seem to be working, certainly in any big city. You've got I won't say any, but most big cities, especially in the West, you've got all kinds of diversity. And the style we will have can include more discussion or more elaboration of particular themes which a student wants to bring in because you're working on an MA, a BA, an idea, a paper for another course. It's fine to combine those. Just say, I'm also using this for 2 other courses, and this is the 3rd course, and I'd like to build on the literature from all 3. That's fine. We do that. What we need are some ideas that hold things together. And the idea, even though the title here says community power, but the big point which evolved from this in the last half of the 20th century was the study of power in general. The general broad background went back to a dichotomy loosely framed from Marx versus Weber. And so Marx stressing a more materialistic, hierarchical stages historically, which went from one to the next, from feudal to capitalism to socialism to communism and so forth. Weber stressed instead, no, we've got diversity, we've got more mixed types, and these have been in the title, for instance, class, status, and power. And so his term status could include all different kinds of things: ethnicity, family, types of industry, but it does stress more the consumption side than the production side, which tended, at least in the Marxist frame, to be more production-oriented, defining class in terms of differential access to the means of production. I just want to give an example or two, just to say we have an election going on in the U.S. pretty soon. How big are the elections? Is this important? Some theorists and some people around the world say, no, elections don't matter. And maybe for some people, for some countries, for some cities, maybe elections don't matter. In 1917, when Lenin and company created the first serious communist state, they said we need to have a constitution, the law, a legal framework. Anybody ever looked at the legal framework? It looks like the U.S. Constitution at the time. U.S. Constitution for Lenin, adopted voluntarily? Yes. So it had, institutions, legal systems, etc., etc. Is that what they did? No. They used the Communist Party instead. But the simple point, one simple point from that is, don't just look at the laws. Those of you who are in pre-law courses, think about it. What we're trying to give you for if you really want to work on the laws, look at the context and where and why and how the framework shifts the ways that the laws work, or more specifically, sometimes the laws get changed. Legislators have a job to make laws, and so they like to think, and the press often follows. You have a new law, this will be very important. Okay. Do people obey? Do people who do better in terms of the law do better in elections? But is it good to be legal? There was a session in New York for a group, and Donald Trump is one of the speakers, and he said, well, I'm glad to be able to be here in New York, not being under subpoena. So he could joke about it, and he's very close to being president. We don't know. But the point I'm making is the law is not the story, or the law is a part of the story, and how big it is depends on whether you're at the law school or whether you're in a country with different kinds of legal systems. Okay. The point I'm getting to behind that is to say, what is power? What is influence? There are many terms, domination, hierarchy, these kinds of things are there, and they're important, and they're going on with your dormitory, with the people you have lunch to, if you're in a fraternity, if you're in a sports team, if you're in a family at home, if you're in a corporation or a job, if you're in a city or a national state, all these have power or interrelations in some ways. And one thing which I'll lay out to some degree is I've done a paper initially, it was called The 16 Faces of Power. There's 16 different aspects of this which are important to pay attention to. And what I'm getting to from that is, and the reason we have this section now, is that it was in this debate over what is power, and it took place roughly from the 50s into the it's still going on. People are still debating over this in terms of ideological good and bad, moralism versus immoral. But also we have analytically, how can we capture this? It's complicated, and there are different ways of interpreting, especially when you get the video, the media and social media have all kinds of wild ways of differentially interpreting the same quote, the facts. So the National Public Radio advertises, we give you the facts. Okay, how do you define facts? That's what the whole discipline of anthropology sort of shifted over to this, asking these kinds of so-called epistemological questions, challenging the normal ways of seeing rational science. Is there any science of people, human beings? And there's a group which is arguing, no, you can't do any science. Whereas others have said, these people don't know what they're saying, so just ignore it. So we've got lots of these things going on. What we're trying to do in this course is to lay out some of the frameworks and some of the ways in which you can have tools, which at least a lot of smart people are using these or develop these. And these tools, these dimensions of power, if you will, largely got developed in the last half of the 20th century. And this is my list of 16 is what we do there. So I want to give you a little bit of history in terms of, maybe we can go to the next slide, which shows if you want me to try, I can try to do that. Yes, yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so I'll say a few words about this. I apologize for my poor handwriting. But you see there, off to the left, further on the left in every sense, is Marx versus Weber. And that is I introduced this with. If we get to and let me mention one or two more names, because this gets to the community, urban side. Before I get to the urban side, the huge debate in terms of bestsellers was C. Wright Mills's book called The Power Elite. And so that was used more often as a national characterization, national governments. And the power elite included business leadership, the executive branch of the U.S. federal government, and so, that is, the simple point is it omitted elections. The U.S. Congress was not considered part of the power elite at all. And so his view came, or that characterization came from a neo-Marxist perspective, but not in too strict a way. And when he later on he wrote a book called The Marxists, and he then shifted his mind, or shifted his main interpretation in the book after roughly in the late 60s. He said, the proletariat is no longer the driver of history. It is, guess who? The students. You are the new proletariat. Remember that? Okay. You're the drivers of history. And there are a lot of others, from Hegel, but also through the innovation people, Jane Jacobs, Florida, and so forth, well, stressing innovation, ideas, the arts, culture. These can at least, maybe we need to say they're the only drivers of history, but at least it's a challenge to the old Marxist the old Marxist label by the same man who wrote the same book called The Power Elite, and then the following title, The Marxists, plural. Okay, so he contrasted that with what was happening in Cuba, and today he can talk about North Korea, or we could say how much there's been a meeting in the last week, BRIC, of China, Russia, South Africa. It's about 35 countries have been meeting in Russia. How much has this been covered in the U.S. Western press? Minimal. Is it important? Is this powerful? Who knows? If you follow probably the press in Moscow, you think it's very, very important. But at least it's a challenge to the global institutions which are seen as the World Trade Center that was attacked. Okay, so in this sense, the ideological overtones of these discussions are clearly still there. So given that, and given that this framework, well, then let's try to say why have people shifted to the urban level? And this was me. I mean, when I was in college, I was reading C. Wright Mills and these kinds of things, trying to understand them at the national level. But then, as I began to read in grad school and say, who's answering these things in a compelling way? And the most compelling people were people doing the urban work. So it was Hunter and versus Dulles who governs. So the Berlins really were the historically important in the U.S. In France, there was a group of them called the Laplacists, who followed a French mining engineer who traveled all around, and he did comparative urban studies of all countries across Europe, basically. And he was trying to see where and why and how do they work. He was thinking in the mind of a mining engineer, trying to see what's the geology of cities and of societies. That same kind of idea was found in the Linz. But the Linz book, L-Y-N-D, focused on one city only. It was a case study called Middletown. It was actually its name was Muncie, Indiana. It was one family whose real name was B-A-L-L, and they made ball jars, which maybe your grandmother used to put apples and fruits and stew them and those kinds of things. Okay. The first version of the book, called Middletown, basically portrayed to simplify, a Weberian, multiple series of chapters, many different kinds of actors. There were business, there were political leaders, there were civic groups, there were citizens, there was the Boy Scouts, all kinds of people that made a difference. In 1937, after 4 or 5 years of depression, they did Middletown in Transition, and the book drastically changed. It was a neo-Marxist interpretation which said there is a business elite, and the Ball family is really dominating the town. And this is a model of society. That is, the idea for doing this from the beginning was not just to do an urban study. They wanted to study the world, people everywhere. But to have that drastic change because of a depression, and I'm pointing as well to C. Wright Mills changing from the power elite to something else, to the students, these are tricky things to say. One is right and one is wrong. Okay. Floyd Hunter is the next arrow, at least in terms of the numbers of lots of people paying attention to him. He was a grad student here in the social work program. He started to work on a PhD, but he moved to Atlanta. He became a social worker and finished it, I think, at University of North Carolina. But basically, it was influenced by those who we'd seen a little bit around here in those years in the 40s and 50s. And the perspective, he didn't say so in the book, but in conferences where I participated with him, he said, is it writing? When I wrote a book, I was a Stalinist Marxist when I wrote the book. Okay, the book, but then he said, I wanted it to be a bestseller. And so when I started to write this as a scholarly book, I had maybe 50, 100 pages. I threw them in the garbage can. I said, this is not going to interest anybody. I'll throw it out, and I'm going to write a bestseller book. And so that was his new book, and it has self-contradictions. There are no clear definitions of concepts. There's no coherent theory. So it had stories, but the thing which was picked up were 3 or 4 things which I'll show in a minute. But my point was, this came out in 1953. And in the next few decades, there were 166 case studies, usually almost always of one city at a time. And most of them, the majority, maybe a bit more than half, followed Hunter. And they basically said, we'll follow his method, and they found, they reported, we have business elites. In that sense, it was a continuation of the Linns. By most of these people, these were political scientists, geographers, sociologists, public administration people. And so one could ask how much are these disciplinary differences, and it was not just one difference, not just one discipline, there were differences there. Okay, so 1961, Dahl's book came out, Who Governs? And he had, these were three very smart grad students who worked with him on the book. Nelson Polsby, Raymond Wolfinger, and Aaron Wildowski. They all did books related to this on their PhDs and following up in the next decades. Two of them ended up at Berkeley and one at Stanford. So they were all, and they had a lot of students who were working with this. And if they worked with them, it worked well. Those of them who got into a fight with them, they came to Chicago and they worked with me and others here. So we had exchanges going on among these kinds of discussions. The discussions. Sometimes they were throwing tomatoes. Sometimes they seemed to be tougher than tomatoes. But my point is, there was a great debate among these people at the lead, but as in various ways. There were maybe 166 people who had published these books, and they had some commitment to an alternative approach. And to try to clarify this, people then began to say, how can we make sense of this debate? So let's shift to the next slide, if you were active, please. And what we emerged was three. Yep, that's good. Three kinds of approaches, from Hunter, Dahl, and then the comparative approach. And we have headings of power, influence, in all three. This was who governs as the guiding question here. And then over here, who governs where, when, and with what effects, which is adding more variables. And let me go through some of these concepts which emerged through this 40, 50 years of arguments and discussions about how to define power, and then how can we measure it, and how can we compare it, and so forth. The first really is, I'll even start here. There's a fourth column, which is leading out historically, but we can call them the traditional elitists, 19th century. The leading theorists here were Pareto and Mosca, Italian sociologist, political science, Pareto, economist as well. And what they basically had a view that there is a strong hierarchy, and that only the people those small number of people at the top dominated everybody else. Okay, what was their evidence? Their evidence, and the classic evidence of most smart Italians for centuries, has been the Roman Empire. Okay, so they looked at the Roman Empire and said, well, this, everybody knew this happened. Caesar came along. They destroyed democracy. So therefore, Caesar showed up with his troops. They marched to Rome. It was illegal to bring your troops into Italy. And so he crossed the river. He came into Italy. Went to Rome. He went right in there, and that was the end of democracy. Okay. So in a sense, I'm teasing a little bit, but not too much. But the point of this is to stress that if you're dealing with distant historical events, you can't interview people. You can't do survey research. You can't reconstruct decisions by getting lots of information. That is, the method tended to be what is called positional. So people who sat in the ancient Roman democratic leadership group, they were assumed, defined, studied as the leaders, the elite, the very top elite. And this went on for many years. For instance, in studies of Russia and of China, when you had people who would sit in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, that was assumed to be, these were the elite of the elite. Which were more important, where and why? That is, most of the Sovietologists or the experts on trying to do this, including many of the people within China, within Russia, they still would, that is, they were not able to do open scientific competing interviews or challenge. And so therefore, the positional definition of elite is still usually used along with other things. But what are the other things? So Hunter said, what we should do is not just take the people who are members of the city council. Let's start with, so he started with people who were newspaper reporters who covered politics in Atlanta, and said, could you give me a list of maybe the 20 most important people in Atlanta? Who's powerful in Atlanta? So he got some names. So he went to those names. This was called snowball sampling. You go to the first person, you've got a list, and when you interview the first person, you say, the big question is, how important are these 20 people? You're one of the 20. Who is most important? Who's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4? And how would you draw arrows among them? Connections. The result was basically what the critics of this methodology later called the reputational, because they had the reputation from the others, and therefore the reputation was the measure of power which Hunter was using by those who came later on. Over here, but just go a little further down in the box here. These elites tended to be identity specific, assumed powerful, but they didn't have much in the way of what is called validity, of ways of validating independently from that source of data. So we have here from Hunter the tradition of there were some traditional background leaders, but basically he wrote it as a bestseller, he hoped, and he had some stories about business leadership in Atlanta, and basically added these to his. But I would say what many people then picked up and said, oh, let's do the same thing in college towns. And so many people at university college towns we do studies of these. And what they also stressed was business leadership, and then materialist, Marxist, loosely, sometimes tried to find a more precisely interpretation. Okay, the revolution was in 1961. So when Dahl's book came out, he said, "You people are doing the wrong things. Your methods are no good. The results are garbage. What you really have to do is study actual concrete decisions. What do people actually do?" Okay, and then we've talked about it a little bit earlier. We've had the book on the reading list. I have it for the exam and so forth. But just to remind you of a couple of big concepts. Issue specificity, big stuff. Instead of saying there's power everywhere, study specific issues explicitly, and he studied mayoral elections, school board, and business and urban development, business development decisions as 3 separate arenas, and found that they were very different in terms of the positional characteristic. That is, who were these leaders? Who were in the positions of being an elite defined in these terms? And the answer was bankers, investors were important as business leaders, because they lent, or they gave the money, they invested themselves for their organizations in business and economic development. Those people were almost zero in mayoral elections and zero in school board activities. So the critical point was look at the issue areas, but then empirically examine how much the people in one issue area overlap or not, and then it's not that it's not something to assume. It can be studied empirically, and he did. They did. So he called it influence instead of power. He stressed issue specificity. He talked not of power in simple terms, but he would talk about resources, and resources were a potential. So if Bill Gates has tons of money in the bank, he may or may not spend it on a mayoral election in his state, his city where he lives, or in how many other cities in the U.S. Maybe 0. Or other people may have very little money, but they may have connections through a union. So through the union, those resources people can get onto the street and work hard, driving people to voting to vote and so forth. So people, organization, money are different kinds of resources. So the let me do the fourth column, and then I'll come back and elaborate that a little. The fourth column is really the comparative studies, which started in the mid-60s. And the new question, which I was part of this, was really who governs where, when, and with what effects. That is, don't just ask who's important by asking them, but asking what difference does it make? Are they making decisions that really lead to more economic development? Do they change the policies in the schools? Do they lead to the mayor to be doing different kinds of strategies and policies? And so all of these need to be directly compared. So and the big point in the adjective is compare cities, starting from the perspective that, look, we've got 166 studies, and they're contradicting each other. They're not all right. Somehow, and so instead of saying that, so one simple answer that some people said was, you're using the wrong method. And that was a major critique at the beginning. You're not using our Dahl New Haven method, you're using a different method, and therefore we're just not going to read your books. Whereas what we said is, we don't know. Let's use this. Let's use all of these methods. Let's use positional, reputational, decisional, and let's compare the results with each of these methods in different cities. And so we started this in 1967. We did the first study of the permanent community sample of the National Opinion Research Center here. Peter Rossi, Bob Crane, and I were leading on this. And the methodology I'm briefly mentioning, we did all of those. I'll just mention just one example. Instead of saying, I think we took we added the environmental issues as well to mayoral election and to schools, because these tend to be big budgetary, big kinds of policies. But we had seen enough, and we're convinced enough that there were differences. But the question was how to capture those. And initially, we were going to hire some of those 166 people to do studies and report back, which they'd done books about. Then as we started, we found these people were so ideological, we didn't trust them. So we hired separate interviewers and gave them exactly the same questions, but don't tell the respondents what to say, okay, and don't interpret it in one way. We want to have more impersonal, universalistic data. Okay, so we got that, and the big finding was huge differences. And so let me just mention, for instance, business leaders in Waco, Texas, and the political leaders in Waco, Texas, supported the same policies. They favored business dominance. Everybody agreed, more or less. That is, they agreed in interpreting, describing who were the leaders, but simultaneously, many of the citizens, this is following later on, for instance, in where this was studied, in the book of we'll talk about it, that is citizens agreed with many of the leaders in many of these cities. Contrast the Boston area. Think of Massachusetts, its culture, its political culture. Nearby Cambridge, or nearby Cambridge, we studied those in detail, and the business leaders in that area near Cambridge, all of them, the business leaders, the political leaders, the civic groups, they all favored helping the poor more. They were in favor of redistribution. And it was a very controversial policy for sure. But the point is to have business leaders in Boston, Cambridge, saying, yes, we want to help the poor more. We need more money from the federal government. We want to use our own money, et cetera, et cetera. That is, this is the total opposite of the Waco, Texas. So the point is, naming a leader as business does not tell you what their policies would be that they would support. So that is, it doesn't matter if you're a business leader, if you like the environment or not. It's not just your personal, it's not being a businessman, it's not being your personal view, because you may want to, if you want to assume, or whatever, or don't, but that a business leader wants to make more money. If he's in development, he's building housing, he may want to say, what's the market buying? If people want to buy with trees on the top, more environmental support, grass, bushes, solar panels, etc., low electrical drain. If people are buying that, entrepreneurs do this. Okay. So in that sense, ideology is not to be ignored, but it's a variable which can be shifted and seen in the context of where and how these other variables shift as well. So comparing is a critical step in doing this, of looking at the differences and then asking why are the differences there. And so we have then on the syllabus we have a couple of case studies. The Governing New York City by Sayre and Kaufman. This is basically these two were political science. They basically reported dispersed influence. In contrast with Hunter, but another well discussed, debated book was Robert Caro, called, I won't give you the title from the top of my head, but it was a study of the one man in New York, Robert Moses, who was a major figure in building freeways and who wanted to put a freeway right across the lower third of Manhattan. And that in turn mobilized Jane Jacobs and others to stop this freeway. We don't want cars in New York, in the whole New York area, certainly not in the middle of Manhattan, and wipe out Greenwich Village, the bohemian capital of the U.S. Okay, so they stopped Robert Moses. They demonstrated. Okay, so the book about Moses basically said Moses was, they didn't call him a dictator, but they said Moses can do anything he wants, etc. So that I'm pointing simply to these case studies that still kept reporting very different interpretations. Edward Banfield, political influence, was some considered the best, one of the best case studies of this sort as a rival to Who Governs. And Banfield had been in Chicago and then went to Harvard, and he was sensitive to differences, including especially then with his student, James Q. Wilson. They began to say, as we go from these three cities, New York, Boston, maybe, and Wilson was from LA, these cities are pretty different. They have different political cultures. And so they played up the values which they called the political culture, and led, of course, by Edward Shills, who really developed this idea. These were students of Shills in that sense. And this was a distinctive Chicago approach that Banfield had articulated here. They generated a lot of attacks against them because they said, how and why was Mayor Daley so powerful? And their basic answer was they built legitimacy, and there was a set of values led, of course, in Bridgeport with Irish Catholic leaders and political activists, neighborhood organizers, precinct captains, the party, the County Democratic Party, which he went into great detail as to how it worked. This was the opposite of what everybody in Hyde Park, most everybody was writing books talking about this. Hyde Park was seen as reform government, and Daley was simply corruption. So Banfield said, that's not corrupt, it's just helping your friends. It's a different political culture. And so this began to bring in political culture in a more serious way of saying where and how should we not just say who has the money, who has the power, but look at values and rules, whether it's laws or not, transforms the value of these different kinds of resources. Okay, I've gone through this column, going through the point that we can have four different kinds of concepts, including the fourth being who governs where, when, and how do these pieces fit together. And I have a framework. We have another little picture. Maybe we could, I should slide through the next ones, and I'll just show that briefly. And then we use all the methods, open-ended and then closed-end reputational and the decisional, and we found all the results, which other people have found as well, in different cities. That was the key point. It wasn't just one finding, but okay, so maybe slowly get some of the right side up, and I'll talk about them when you. Okay, here's the framework. This is good. So this framework you've already seen before. You've seen it in the new political culture, and you've seen it in we'll just give it 1 minute or say, and then we'll do maybe three other pictures, right? Okay. But let's try to get them right side up. Okay, so the framework has got outputs, and we've got intermediary things. These two boxes are really the leaders, but leaders can be more informal, or they can be elected officials. And each of these should be studied and connected to those other variables which may lead to them. So basically the picture gives you a set of propositions, implicit propositions, and what we have in the reading is called community structure and decision making. And it has a set of 15 or so propositions which are summarized in this kind of a framework, which is a comparative analytical framework, which was the first time that this had really been articulated as a way of doing this kind of thing. So we had contributors who've been moving in the same direction, but I pulled them together in this. Okay, you can't easily turn that thing. So okay, well, never mind. The chapter is on campus with, I think, all of these pictures. I'm trying to give you one or two of the most important pictures from an entire book or an entire chapter. So this is one, but let's just go on. Let's go on to the next, and I'll just flag these to you. Okay, these are examples of propositions. If we can turn that so we can just see one proposition. Okay. The higher the educational level of community residents, the more pluralistic the decision-making structure. Okay, and that's a clear, simple, specific proposition. So if you're in a college town where more highly educated citizens, you're likely to have a different set of policy preferences, probably more legalistic and more so-called reform, and not the unspoken, let's say spoken, but quietly spoken deals, which may be important, as Banfield would stress. Okay, so I won't try to go through those in detail, simply to see that the propositions are ways of connecting the pieces. Okay, so that's good. So let's back up the one before. Well, okay, if we're here, let's just stay with what we can read. Okay, so here we have, just briefly, this is from the community structure and decision making. What this does here in this, and I'll just flash forward to the Scenescapes book. The same thing is in the Scenescapes book and in the in here is the idea of buzz. And so resources can get to buzz if resources have different values. And what this stresses is extending the idea from dull of issue specificity. So what we do is to look at prestige value, interactional importance, power value, or index of general applicability. That is, the idea was to these are contexts. These are contexts within which resources get used. So here are these 13 are right out of Dahl's book. These are his 13. Other people have elaborated this and done this. We've had 3 or 4 times as many more. But the point of things like obvious things: money, control of the media, control over jobs, legality, subsystem solidarity, the right to vote, and so forth. Okay, so these resources, the point which Dahl did not do is to ask these comparative context questions. Why is legality more important? And what that proposition would say, in a town with less educated residents, legality may value less. Okay. And similarly, if we have the prestige value, that is how much do you convert, or say, the prestige may be the right to vote and subsystem solidarity, manpower. Over here we may have money and credit may directly not have convertibility into prestige, but if we take, say, the more abstract label of subsystem solidarity, Dahl did not use the names of ethnic groups. In that sense, he followed that New England style of saying the Irish want this and the Italians want that. So he gave it a little more general label of people who migrated into New England in those years. But what I'm doing, in a sense, is saying, if we want to look at the name that would be used in the press, or the name in speeches, am I going to vote for him? If he's an Italian and I'm an Italian, then yes. Okay, so subsystem solidarity, or is ethnicity in that sense, has a lot of prestige within that ethnic group. So that's the idea that the rules of the game shift as we go from one setting, one context, one scene to another. So what I'm pointing out is that when I published this in 1968, the core of these ideas, which came elaborated, what became later on in Scenescapes, and so it's not as if maybe it's not as original after all. But on the other hand, the core, these are important ideas which emerge from the late 20th century, not just from me, but from other people thinking about this. But we've tried to, in each case, systematize it and push it further than others have done. Could we go to the other pictures? Anything that's quick and easy to look at? I'll mention that. Then we should. Trying to see my version of this. We have another, the other one is called resources by what? B-U-Y, what? And the idea is, again, to try to begin to, yes, that's it, to articulate what are the institutional mechanisms, what are the characteristics of the context by which we can convert one of these into another. So instead of keeping, and I deliberately, I retained Dahl's exact list in order to show that you can go a lot further than Dahl did. And so if we have, say, one of these, like money and credit, how much can be converted into control over jobs? And we call that high. That's an H. That just can't be clear. That's an H, but that's a high. So that money and credit is you can buy jobs in a sense. You can pay people. Control to the means of mass media, that has high control because you can buy a newspaper and put your views there. How about the high social status? That's not quite so easy. Legality is medium, and so nevertheless, I use money at the top because it's relatively flexible. You can do lots of things more easily with it. Some of these other things may take generations to build, like ethnic solidarity in one city, and so forth. So, for the simple point is, no one of these resources dominates all the others. Depending on the context, they may be high, medium, or low. So in that sense, what this tries to say, and it's not as if this is meant to be a solid, quantitatively measured set of numbers, but to simply say, think about these, conceptualize resources, and the context within which they may work is critical. That is, if you don't know what you can do with that resource, and I use the case of, say, Bill Gates, who may not have spent it, and then what, or say the version in the book by Who Governs on New Haven was the first half of the 19th century was dominated by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Almost all of the city council members and the mayors were of that ethnic background. The end of the 19th century, they all lost. They lost the elections. But what they did, and Dahl just sort of mentions it in passing, but the point is, it's not necessarily holding everywhere else. That is, what happened to those white Anglo-Saxon old elites? They moved to the suburbs. They stopped doing politics. They did other things. By contrast, Gabriel Allman did a PhD on New York City, and he did not find that. That is, there still were some white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who instead fought the new immigrants and showed that they could, and in some other cities, one could add, could create civic associations or good government associations. And so you had many different kinds of debates, especially as you cross the U.S. You get to California. The entire state of California did not exist until the late 19th century. So when the state law was written, they said, you may not have political parties in local elections. You want to have LA, Berkeley? Can you have a Democratic and Republican Party? No. State law does not permit you to have the party label, because you must have nonpartisan elections. So these kinds of things became legally changeable, and in those ways, I'm using that as an example of the context. The scene changes, and that in turn changes the resources and their values as we want to use them for different purposes. Okay. let me pause for a bit if we have any questions from what I've said here thus far. Want to raise anything? No. Okay. Nobody else. All right. Let me then, in terms of getting big points out here, I'm going to say a bit, drawing on my paper on the 16 Faces of Power, just to put I want to get these terms out so you can see and hear these kinds of things, because they're not in any one place, and especially Dahl's brilliant book, Who Governs, has none of this. That is, I won't say none. He, like Hunter, wanted to write a bestseller, and it did. Our dean, Mark Hansen, former dean of Social Science Division, said he was a student of Dahl, and he would reread Who Governs once a year, through his whole career here. So people are doing that. Okay, he didn't articulate this. He wrote an earlier book with Harold Laswell called Power, and nobody read that because it was too abstract. It was clear, articulate social science, and nobody read it. So Who Governs has many of those same ideas, but I'm going to articulate some of this, which is not in any one place. Okay, what's power? One kind of idea, this is quasi-definitional, but they're not just definitions, these are sort of components of power and influence, which we can bring in here. One, interpersonal influence. The more general idea is that power involves an interpersonal relationship whereby A does something and to try to change B. So A leads B to do something different. Okay, that's a simple idea which Dahl basically is using and discussing power. Second, anticipated reactions. It may be that B is there. I know he wants me to do that, so I'll do it before he asks. Who's then exercising power over whom? That's a little more tricky. It's his definition of what he thinks maybe he's going to do, and I'm going to anticipate that, and I'm going to do something else. But maybe it's not really what he would have said. It's something a little better in my interest. Okay, so the anticipated reactions are an important dimension, but it's hard to capture if only you look at direct influence. So point 3 is look for direct and indirect influence. So we can have A through B, or A be anticipated through C, leading to more complicated causal paths. And some of these can be more directly studied if you ask questions if one uses a decisional method. Just let me add, I didn't mention explicitly, but very good. I'm doing it so here now that the decisional method basically asks direct open questions. And then often we used a version of this which had sort of 5 dimensions. Who initiated this idea? Who supported it? Who opposed it? Who mediated? And who tended to prevail? Those kinds of 5 questions are core aspects of a decisional method, in contrast to the reputational method of Hunter. The 4th idea is reciprocity, is the idea, again, of an asymmetrical relationship, in that it may be that A does something that B does differently, but if B in turn says, I did this for you, will you in turn give me something back from you instead? And so you may have A leading to B and B leading to A. It's not as if A leads only to B. Maybe you have both arrows going each way. Point 5, action and inaction. It may be that by doing nothing, you can be making an important impact. Power may be exerted quite forcefully despite the absence of any overt action, just to maintain the status quo, the so-called foreign policy of containment, or the big concepts using in a lot of literature, or the mobilization of bias, which can result in significant advantages of one group over another. Then there are negative decisions versus non-decisions. A negative decision is if you have, see, a city council that votes and we say, no, we don't want that. That's a negative decision. A non-decision, you don't even discuss it. So at the beginnings, for instance, and we had several PhDs were studying the emergence of the environmental concerns as a set of issues. And Gary, Indiana, I mean, that whole, when I first came here, you had to turn on your windshield wipers every single day because you had so much dirt on your windshield. You couldn't see through the wind seat because there was so much dirt from over the night. Okay, so this Chicago is now a very clean city compared to then, and so if you went to the major sources with South Chicago, the city, but then also Gary, Hammond, whole south end of Lake Michigan was pumping smoke that came all over the city and all over the whole area. And so, did this come up in the cities? So we studied these cities of Hammond and Gary and so forth. They never talked about it. They didn't act. They didn't say we want to pollute. They said no, that's just life. Do you want to make it cleaner? No. That is okay. So the city councils didn't do anything at the beginning. Okay. So the negative and non-decisions were then connected to what other people then would call latent issues or the mobilization of bias. And Dahl was then criticized as having a mobilization of bias by not looking at those things which maintain the status quo. That in turn leads to the concept of point 6, the patterns of value distribution. And if you're going to say there's a bias, we have to say bias in terms of what? So we can then try to say that power can be seen as the realization of the values or the attainment of goals, in addition to calling attention to the value element of power implementations. This stresses that this leads into different conceptions of democracy or pluralism or hierarchy or elitism. So Hunter argued there was a so-called monolithic elite which controlled what he called regional city, Atlanta. And that this monolithic elite controlled in ways that, so I'm going over some people along the way, gradually began to challenge Hunter, Rossi, Ager, Goldrich, and Swanson, and so forth. I want to keep going and just give you at least these dimensions without trying to go into too much detail. There's a lot of literature on all of these things. What you can then do is maybe make a fourfold table and how you can have social background of leaders which may be unified or diversified, and then you can have value systems which are unified or diversified. And the point of that is Hunter was describing people who are business background, and he assumed or described that they were really assumed they had a unified view that business is good and business leaders will be the source of their goals. By contrast, Rossi had done a case study where he showed that you had people who may be a business elite, that is, they may be unified, or they may be a political elite, or they may be Irish or whatever, but they may have even if they have unified social background, they may have diversified values. That is, they may be Irish who are Democrats and Irish who are Republicans, or Irish who have different policies, or different ethnic groups vary in their degree to which they work together or not. So one woman who would, and when I talked about the Irish ethic paper, she studied and she contrasted Jews and Irish in the Chicago City Council, and several Jewish leaders basically said, you know, we're Jewish, but we disagree. That's the way we do things in general. Whereas the Irish said the opposite. You know, we're the Irish. We might be different, but we're going to work together in the council. And then African Americans tend to be more like the Jews in the sense of fighting against each other. And so the multiple views and part of why African Americans have a harder time having impact in the city council is because there are different policy views among the African Americans. I say as a resident of Brownsville. Dimension 7, legitimation. Legitimation joins the values with hierarchy. And Weber's threefold famous typology of traditional, charismatic, and bureaucratic is there different ways, different criteria by which you can generate or support an action, and it may work that if in one or another, and so he wrote about these with many different comparative societies in mind. What was legitimate for power in India? What was legitimate for power in China? And how is that different between the Catholics in Southern Europe and the Protestants in Northern Europe? Each of those were different, and that's what in turn leads to the different types of legitimacy and how values interpenetrate these institutions, even if they're not in the laws. Number 8, number of participants in a decision. Very simple idea. Do you have a lot of people involved, or is this a very small elite? Some people like Mansur Olson build a whole theory into the size of the decision-making group, and that in turn leads to those which tend to focus on for instance, the collective good, concept of public good, as Samuelson termed it. Point 9, scope of power, issue importance. The different issues may vary in their importance. So some research has said we want to study. We go to a new town. We want to do a new study. We should choose what should we study. Obviously, we should study the most important people to the people in that town. Many studies of these 166 did that. If you do that, can you compare this to city number 2? No, because they're studying different issues. It doesn't ask or frame why do people in the town may think that the environment is important in Hyde Park, but they don't think it's important in Gary. Okay, so issue importance and criteria for defining issues in their salience is interpenetrated with values, and so we've got a bunch of stuff here about criteria that have been or could be used, but the basic idea is to look closely at the ways that values work. Point 10, visibility, closely related to indirect influence or patterns of value distribution, the numbers of persons involved, and the importance of the issue, and is specifically visibility. And so I'll just leave it at that. Point 11, power bases, another problem which may be dealt with. The bases of power is the social analogy of potential energy in physics. A number of writers of community power have compiled lists of important bases of power, especially Dahl's list. But I'll leave it as that for now, simply to say that list of dimensions is of resources has an arbitrariness. Number 12 is the application of power, which is the analogy of the loss or the cost of exercising a particular resource. And some of them are easy. You write a check and you spend the money and you can maybe transfer the resource. If instead you've got to convince the Irish to vote for a Republican or a Democrat or for a different candidate, it may not be so easy to transform those willingnesses to vote. So we have the 13th dimension of the efficiency of power application. And efficiency of power application is what Dahl really focused on. The next one is a trickier one, at least I'll throw out, which came from the zero-sum problem and the allocation of resources. And the way I'll just introduce that briefly because we're not going to have a lot of discussion right now. Talcott Parsons did 4 famous essays on power, influence, and the like, and he published them as a book on how they work together. And the big idea was that Dahl was wrong from the very beginning. If you conceive of A leads to B and B leads to C, and power is that, you're missing the boat. How so? Dahl was the #1 political scientist in the world at the time. So Parsons is over here at Harvard. You're wrong. So why was he wrong? Parsons said, power is not one line, one simple thing like that. Power is like money, if we think about it. Let's think about money the way economists think about money. The quantity of money may go up or down. We can have inflation or deflation. We can have a value which can be redefined through the banks or through a government which says we want to change the value of the dollar compared to the Argentine money. And the Argentine money may have their own, so things go up and down. And power is like that. Power is like bugs. Activity within a city. And where and how can we make sense of this? We can try to adapt many of the propositions about where the economy works can also be used to study power in the political system. And that was he wrote this about the time that the political scientists were saying, hey, let's do that. So they embraced a lot of economics. It was called public choice or social choice. And that seemed to be the dominant spirit of the dominant theory. Look at the APSI. in the 70s, Nelson Polsby his name is gone, but he was the editor of the American Political Science Review at that point, and he certainly shifted to so what we now have in the social sciences are economists who are writing books called Freakonomics, and they're using concepts that come from sociology and anthropology, and from data from any sort. So AI is building answers by taking tons and tons of data, building new headline today, that XAI is doing stuff because they want to have massive amounts of ability to build these databases in which we can then try to see the causal arrows, maybe, depending on how we build these things. But my point is AI connects to all this stuff that I've been talking about. We can try to see what are the equations that we can write which lead to these things working in one. Or if we do, how does the GNP work? GNP is thousands of equations. It includes a choice by a person who's modeling the GNP, but it includes assumptions or about things of this sort. So I will end there simply with a point that these things are critical not only for laypersons, for bankers, for economists, for social scientists, and that these are still being used in different writings. If you look at the family, you look at international relations, within Israel, within the Ukraine right now, people are arguing and they're using these kinds of terms. I've been in meetings with these people in Israel, etc. And I've been amazed at how much they ignore a lot of what I've just told you. But I'll end there with that as we are at the end of the hour. But I'll hesitate very briefly. Any questions you want to throw in about AI?
Yeah, AI. Because I'm currently trying to understand how AI used to improve the scientific research.
Could you just show your face a little bit?
Okay. Yeah. I just talking with one people who working with the AI technology this morning, and we try to know because AI trying based on a lot of different data sets, different research area. So we currently try to see if we set up baseline from one specific area, political science, and we can add some more. We can refine this model by using different technology knowledge from different research areas or some design, CS, or art. So we can see how this technology improve in this system, and they will give our specific outcome and compare this outcome before and after we using new knowledge. So
what's the word? A new what?
New knowledge.
New knowledge.
Yeah, we can see some new pattern.
Or you're saying pattern as well. That is, I think you're saying something very similar to this kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
That is that we call it the context within which resources get spent.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, we could adapt this or try to use this with AI tools and technology and thinking these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very similar. And because the outcome may be very different, and we can measure them as in a space dimension, like 3D dimension, not just the 2D dimension. So we are thinking about these things, and I think it's very interesting because how AI to predict a new knowledge or social science, or scientific issue. Yeah.
Okay, now let me ask you a question. I'm trying to keep it very simple and let you elaborate more in terms of AI. I've heard two kinds of answers at the conference on AI that James Evans and company organized in just the week about 1 month ago. And they had international experts on AI from Switzerland to MIT to California to Asia and so forth. One kind of answer was the concluding statement by the MIT speaker And he basically said we should follow the approach and the rationale of econometrics. And basically, and by that he meant be inductive. Don't think in the sense of generating a theory or an abstract proposition. Take the data, and the data source ought to give you the answers. Okay, so that means I was surprised at the degree to which he said this is AI, or it should be AI. Okay. The second approach, it seems to me, is in a paper, say, by James Evans in the American Sociological Review, or HAS, and it basically says we can take the words. So if we have thousands of newspapers or books, or if we say let's take the economics journals and the political science journals and the design journals and the artistic journals, they may have different causal models that we could see in their statements if we use those LL bits of data, large information that we can draw from these. This is an alternative which can include ideas, abstractions, and include Hegel. If you say we'll take Hegelian theories, these should show us, they would say, rationality is this. Whereas the MIT guy will say rationality is what we measure in a different way. But there's no theory that we will use. Okay, so I'm putting forth two potentially competing uses or framings of AI, and if we can get the beginnings of an answer, I'd be very interested. And or if we pursue this in another session, that would be great too.
Yeah.
And you want to? Could you comment briefly?
Yeah, I need to think about.
Yes, my question clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay, good.
Give me some time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because I'm also just starting touch about this area.
Okay. Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. We'll quit for today then.